This is Land of Havilah, Matthew 23. Jesus did not like religion for display. Verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sat on Moses' seat. All things, therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, observe and do. But don't do their works, for they say and don't do. For they bind heavy burdens that are grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not lift a finger to help them. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad, enlarge the fringes of their garments, and love the place of honor at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, the salutations in the marketplaces, and to be called Rabbi, Rabbi by men. But don't you be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and all of you are brothers. Call no man on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Neither be called masters, for one is your Master, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Comment: in verses 2 and 3, the scribes and Pharisees sat on Moses' seat, meaning God gave them their authority, Exodus 29:9, so people should obey them. But it was a case of do what they say, not what they do. In verse 4, quote, they bind heavy burdens that are grievous to be borne, end quote. If it was just the law of Moses they were teaching, it would have been fine, but they were also teaching man-made commandments on top of it, Mark 7:7, and they weren't willing to lift a finger to help, meaning they didn't offer any encouragement, only more burdens. In verse 5, it was all a show to be seen by men. Everything was to magnify themselves. They knew the public would be in awe of them if it seemed they were keeping heavy rules. So they just made more rules, the heavier the better, and ignored them. In verses 5 through 10, Jesus gave some specific examples. Everything was for self-glorification. The way they dressed, the way they sought after the best seats at banquets and in the synagogue, the way they greeted each other, which was elaborately scripted, and the way they relished titles such as teacher, father, and master. Jesus said to the public, Call no man your teacher, father, or master, because only he and God the Father were any of those. Certainly there are legitimate teachers such as of math or history, and legitimate fathers and mothers such as parents of children, and legitimate masters of a craft such as a master painter, but we shouldn't apply those terms as religious titles. Someone might be a legitimate Bible teacher, spiritual father, or maybe even a master of some discipline having to do with theology, but titles shouldn't put anyone in an intermediary position between us and God. The path to God is straight. It's not through anyone else. Our prayers take a direct path to God, and the answer returns directly to us. In verses 11 and 12, it's impossible for anyone to elevate himself in the kingdom of God, because if he does, God will bring him low. But if a person humbles himself, God will exalt him. Coming up, a sampling of why the scribes and Pharisees have it coming. 7 woes for the scribes and Pharisees. Verse 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and as a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you don't enter in yourselves, neither do you allow those who are entering in to enter. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel around by sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourselves. Comment: in verse 13, the scribes and Pharisees devoured widows' houses, and as a pretense made long prayers. They prayed for pay. Someone would come to them, such as a widow, and they prayed a long time for them, knowing that the longer they prayed, the more likely the person would give a good donation. Anybody was fair game, rich man, poor man, widow, it didn't matter. In verse 14, they didn't enter the kingdom of heaven themselves or allow anyone else to enter. As an example, they didn't accept what Jesus said, and they didn't allow anyone else to listen. Quote, the Jews had already agreed that if any man would confess him as Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue, John 9:22. In verse 15, they went far and wide to make converts for hell. Coming up, another evidence of their condemnation, that they justified their lies. Verse 16, Woe to you, blind guides, who say, Whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? Whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obligated. You fools, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? He therefore who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who has been living in it. He who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Comment: In the law of Moses, God allowed a person to swear an oath, but with the following caveat, quote, When a man swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Numbers 30, verse 2. God is our example in truthful speech. Quote, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will not make it good? Numbers 23:19. God said, You shall be holy, for I am holy. Leviticus 11:44. Speaking truthfully and fulfilling vows are part of being holy. When God swears an oath, he's on solid ground because he has the power to fulfill it, and he has the character that he'll do anything to fulfill it, no matter how much pain it causes him. For example, he swore an oath that through a descendant of Abraham he would bless all the nations of the earth. Genesis 22:16-18. He fulfilled the vow by sending Christ, even though the sending was very painful. So he has the power to follow through and the personal commitment to follow through. Men, on the other hand, often lack the power, Matthew 5:36, and to our shame, we lack the commitment sometimes. Even the simplest promise might prove difficult to fulfill. So we shouldn't make a statement in the future tense of the verb, as in, I will do this or that. It's better to make a statement in the present tense of the verb, as in, I plan on doing this or that. Planning is something we do right now, so let's just say what we plan on doing, not what we will do, when we can get by with just that much. If we go further and make a vow, we've committed ourselves to a future that only God controls. Therefore, it only makes sense to be very careful before we make a commitment. We see it in the marriage vow, for example, that many times men and women fall short. The marriage vow is the ultimate example that vows can be more difficult than we thought. If any divorced person feels as if he or she has committed an unforgivable sin, he should keep remembering the woman at the well who was divorced 5 times, John 4:18, but Jesus offered her salvation, John 4:10. When we take a vow, we should commit to it 100%, and because sin is difficult to tame, we're going to need help beyond ourselves. God will help, that's a given, so if we fail in the vow, it's all on man. In verses 16-22, the scribes and Pharisees made light of vows like children with their fingers crossed behind their backs. For example, they said in verse 16, a vow by the temple is nothing. It only counts if you swear by the gold of the temple. In making a vow, there aren't any outs except in keeping the vow, or failing that, throwing ourselves on God's mercy. In verse 22, God is witness of every vow from where he sits on the throne, and there aren't any cheap tricks getting around them. Now more woes, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have left undone the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. But you ought to have done these and not to have left the other undone. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and unrighteousness. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the platter, that its outside may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitened tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but inwardly are full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Comment: in verse 23, the Pharisees obeyed the law of Moses in small things, such as in tithing garden herbs, which was right, but they disregarded the weightier things, namely justice, mercy, and faith. Therefore, when they presented their garden herbs, it was an offense to God that they gave him only tokens of obedience rather than real obedience. We should get the weightier things right and not leave the rest undone. The tithing of garden herbs was a gnat. To think that they could ignore justice, mercy, and faith was the swallowing of a camel. In verses 25 through 28 regarding cups, platters, and tombs, they focused on how they looked to men on the outside, but God focused on the inside. Coming up, their ancestors persecuted God's messengers, and they are doing the same. Verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the tombs of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you testify to yourselves that you are children of those who killed the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your fathers. Comment, they believed had they been alive in the olden days, they wouldn't have persecuted the prophets. But Jesus says they would have. They're the same as their ancestors. The proof is that they're persecuting him. To transfer it to ourselves, we might imagine that if we had lived in Nazi Germany, we would have been heroes and stood up to the evil. We would have subjected ourselves to persecution before we would allow anyone else to be persecuted. But the truth is that the vast majority of the public did not speak up. Many of the public even counted the evil as good. It's easy to think of ourselves as much better than we are. It's easy to be hypnotized by public propaganda. It's difficult to go against the flow. That's why Romans 12:2 is so important. Quote, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what is the good, well-pleasing, and perfect will of God. End quote. There's a vast difference between what's publicly acceptable and expected versus what God accepts and expects. Still speaking to the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus says he's going to send them more prophets, and he predicts they'll persecute them horrifically. Verse 33. You serpents, you offspring of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of Gehenna? Therefore, behold, I send to you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you killed between the sanctuary and the altar. Most certainly, I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. Comment, verse 34 is a window into the times that, had we been there, we would have known that the rulers of the Jews wielded frightful power. They could flog or pass a death sentence. But if it was death, they had to get the Romans to agree, John 18:31. But the Romans were often happy to oblige, Acts 12:1-3. In the case of Stephen, they stoned him in a rage without consulting the Romans, Acts 7:58. In verse 34, Jesus predicted they would persecute the coming prophets of the new covenant, which they did, starting with him, then continuing after him. Coming up, Jesus didn't enjoy saying any of this. He bemoaned it all. Verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I would have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me from now on, until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Comment, God sent prophets because of his compassion. Quote, Yahweh, the God of their fathers, sent to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until Yahweh's wrath rose against his people, until there was no remedy. 2 Chronicles 36:15-16. In verse 38, Jesus predicted a soon coming day in which there would be no remedy but destruction. He fulfilled the day of destruction in 70 A.D. Quote, Behold, your house is left to you desolate. End quote. There'll be more destruction at the end of time when the entire earth is beyond remedy. 2 Peter 3:11. In verse 39, he predicted his return. Quote, You will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Matthew 24 is next at landofhavilah.net. Matthew 24.